He's a professor now at Princeton in Middle East policy. And so his experience, I think, speaks for itself. It's an honor and privilege for us to have him here. Any speaker on any topic, certainly on a topic as complicated as the Middle East and Israel, is going to have positions that some of which we may agree with, some of which we may disagree with. But with Ambassador Kurtzer, he has tremendous experience. It's well thought out, it's reasoned, and so I'm sure I'm looking forward to an interesting, fascinating, and thought-provoking evening. So thank you for being here. Pleasure to introduce Ambassador Dr. Kurtzer.
Good evening. Thank you all for the invitation to join you in this series, and particularly thank you to the sponsors. I want to recognize Rabbi Top and Rabbi Posey for all the nice work that they did in getting me out here. I appreciate that. The topic tonight, of course, is one of controversy, and that is what do we do about the Middle East? This is a region that has replaced in academic studies economics as the dismal science. We've spent many years, analysts, policymakers, trying to understand this region and have not reached conclusions that have withstood the test of time. In fact, over the past couple of years, particularly since the Arab revolutions of 2011, I've brought to mind an old cartoon that some of you may remember. It was the construction of a skyscraper set to the Hungarian Rhapsody. And as the builders are building this very tall building and the music is reaching a crescendo, it finally concludes with the conductor/architect shutting the front door of this skyscraper, and the building collapses. It's not unlike the story some of you may have heard about the man who approaches his rabbi to ask, how do you build a house? The rabbi pulls a volume of the Talmud off the shelf, opens it up to a certain page, and points out that there's a prescription in the Talmud to how to do that. The man goes out, builds the house according to the prescription in the Talmud, closes the front door when he finishes, and the house collapses. He goes back to the rabbi and says, Rabbi, I followed all the directions, and the house collapsed. So what happened? The rabbi says, well, that's Rashi's question. In the field that I chose, political science, in academia, and then policymaking, we often resort to the same problem. Rashi's question about what it is that's gone wrong with what we've analyzed and tried to understand. And in this region, the problems that we've faced are endemic and seemingly impervious to change. What are they? And how do we begin to even cope with those problems? What we do know about the Middle East and what has remained constant, certainly from before the Arab Spring, as it was called in 2011, and since, is that it's a region that is characterized by brutally repressive governance in almost every state. There are no democracies in the Middle East other than the state of Israel. There are some pretenders to democracy, but they all fail that test. It's a region in which there are seemingly endless wars. I did a survey some years ago of casualties in various Middle Eastern conflicts. And it won't surprise you that the casualty rate in the Arab-Israeli conflict was near the bottom of the list. There are far more serious conflicts in this region, many of which we have not paid much attention to, including the internal war in Algeria, the civil war in Sudan, certainly what's happening today in Syria and in Yemen. And this is a region that simply produces war. It produces conflict both within societies and between them. It's a region of weak regimes that have very powerful individual autocrats, authoritarian leaders, but very, very fragile. And we saw that in 2011 when a fruit vendor in Tunisia, who self-immolated as a result of the impact of governmental decisions on his pride, brought tens of thousands of people into the street, and which brought about the end of the Ben Ali dictatorship. We saw it in the events in Tahrir Square in Egypt, how weak regimes are and what they have to do to protect themselves. It's an area and a region in which, interestingly, the only stable governments, certainly over the past decade, have been the monarchies. If you look around this region, the 8 monarchies, 6 Gulf states, Jordan and Morocco, have been relatively immune from what has beset the rest of the region. But what does that tell us about politics and policymaking in that region? It's a region in which the word Praetorian republics was invented. Back in the 1960s, political scientists developed this idea that maybe there would be a modernizing force from among the military, particularly in the Middle East. These were educated, young, middle-class people who, what it was thought, would bring about a positive change. Well, that hasn't happened. We still have Praetorian republics in which the military either actually exercises power or sits behind the throne of power, controlling the levers of authority. But it's certainly not a modernizing force within these societies. It's a region beset by corruption, crony capitalism, which has led to an extreme inequality of wealth. When my wife and I and family were stationed in Egypt, we were actually there twice. We served from 1979 to 82 as a more junior officer, and then went back as ambassador in 1998. For entertainment, we would often go downtown Cairo and watch these extraordinarily lavish weddings alongside the poverty of a lower-tier third world developing country. And that inequality of wealth has only grown over the years. We talk about it in our own country, but it is nowhere near as serious a problem here, however serious it is, as it is in the Middle East, where virtually all the wealth in most of those societies is concentrated in very few hands, and they take that wealth and invest it outside of the country in sovereign wealth funds. So that even if they have accumulated the wealth and might have invested it locally for the good of society, that doesn't happen. They take the money and put it in Swiss, London, UK, US banks, and provide no benefit to their own societies. It's a region in which there's been a population boom, an enormous population boom, which has exacerbated already existing problems of how do you feed this growing population, how do you provide jobs? Back in 1980, the U.S. Embassy in Cairo brought over an American population specialist to brief then President Anwar Sadat on the implications for Egypt of its growing population. And at that time, when we served in Egypt the first time, had a population of about 34 million people. And our expert, using graphs and charts and drawing on his expertise, explained to Sadat that even if Egypt achieved zero population growth the next day, which of course was not going to happen, but even if Egypt achieved zero population growth the next day, the population would double over the next 20 years simply as a result of inertia. And so imagine, this expert said, if Egypt does not achieve zero population growth. Well, today Egypt is approaching 100 million people. And it has put such a burden on that society that it simply can't cope. One example, Cairo University, which once was one of the great universities in the Middle East, even a good university in world standards, is no longer functional. Built for about 20 to 25,000 students, there are about 140,000 students, many of whom graduate without ever seeing the inside of a classroom, including medical students who never see the inside of a laboratory, simply because there's no space. Egypt did a survey in the 1990s when the first Islamic uprising took place as to what prompted young Egyptians to take up arms against the government. in the name of Islam. The assumption in doing this survey, which was conducted by Egyptian sociologists, the assumption was that they were attracted by religious ideology. This was religious fervor that would drive them to do what they did. To their surprise, to the surprise of the Egyptian government, they found something quite different. Most of those who had engaged in the uprising, and it probably is accurate to say it about those involved today in similar activities, were actually middle-class or lower-middle-class young people who had hoped that education and progress would allow them upward mobilization. They'd get jobs, they'd be able to live better than their parents. And of course they were disappointed they couldn't. And along came the imam and promised them salvation, promised them work. Most of them simply became more religious, and some of them took up violence in the name of that religion. So the population boom and the inequalities and the corruption and the authoritarianism is not a problem simply confined to the internal politics of these societies, but it's a problem that we have seen all too often explode beyond the particular societies and engulf the region and the rest of the world. Against this backdrop, if we take a step back and look at the past 25, 30 years, this particular region experienced 5 seismic shocks, shocks to the system that, in the context of an already weak basis, were bound to create very serious problems. The first, paradoxically, was the end of the Cold War. Now, you can say to yourself, well, why is that a negative shock to the system? Well, the reality is that during the Cold War, smaller countries, we sometimes call them client states, had learned how to live in a bipolar world. They learned how to play the United States and the Soviet Union off against each other. And very often it was they who dictated the terms of the relationship, because the two superpowers were competing for influence, competing for alliances, and would often have to meet the demands of the client states in ways that looked a little bit like an auction. A country would come to us, they'd come to the Soviet Union, and they'd play us off against each other. Comes 1991, and you wake up one morning in December, and it's a unipolar world. The United States won the Cold War. There was no longer a Soviet Union at all, in fact. There was Russia and a number of former Russian states. And what this did in the Middle East was to present them with a dilemma of how to conduct their own politics and policies vis-a-vis the international community. Now, interestingly, some of them decided, having put their finger up in the wind, that they had to go with the winner. And so we saw when the second shock occurred, which was the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990, leading to the first Gulf War, we saw an unprecedented event occur. And that was that a large part of the Middle East, large number of states in the Middle East, joined the international coalition that was led by the United States to push back against Arab aggression conducted against another Arab state. In the history of this region, that had never happened before. Normally, it was either the region against itself or the region against the international community. But here, the United States drew into the international coalition to oust Iraq from Kuwait. States such as Egypt, which sent 2 divisions to fight alongside the United States in Saudi Arabia as we proceeded into Kuwait. Syria, which sent a division to fight alongside the international coalition. We established bases in Saudi Arabia, a country that had previously committed never to allow foreigners, certainly not Christian or Jewish foreigners, to establish bases in their country. But the shock of the end of the Cold War and the shock of Arab aggression against Arab, those 2 shocks changed the Middle East dramatically during that period. Third shock to the system was the Arab uprisings in 2011. By that time, the world has settled into something other than unipolarism. The United States is still, certainly was in 2011 and still is today, the preeminent power in the world. We still have the strongest economy, we have the strongest military, we have an unparalleled degree of strength vis-a-vis the rest of the world. But we no longer have a monopoly on diplomatic or political influence and power. And so a kind of multipolarism grew up in the intervening years, so that at the time of the Arab uprisings, there were a variety of places to which Arab countries could turn for support. And yet none of those countries to which they turned provided any kind of help in managing what was effectively an internal set of revolutions. We also saw in the 2011 Arab uprisings the appearance on the Middle East scene of a new phenomenon called the people. Now before that time, if you were analyzing Middle Eastern affairs, you would say, well, you've got governments, some of them pretending to be republics, some of them monarchies. You've got Islamic movements, most of them underground, because they were seen as antithetical to the regime's purposes and programs. You had what's now called the deep state bureaucracies, that what was government policy. But what we call people power had never before manifested itself in the Middle East. And then it happened in 2011. Those who went out to Tahrir Square were not directed by any of those forces, but were rather what we would call common folk, who had been fed up with the system. They were fed up with Mubarak's rule. They were fed up with what looked like his decision to pass along the presidency to his son. They were simply fed up. Now, the problem of the people power in the Middle East was that it had no gas. It had no staying power. It had no leadership. It had no program. It had no direction. And so as soon as it appeared, it disappeared, leaving behind a residual sense of frustration on the part of large swaths of the population in this region, but with no direction for them to take to deal with that frustration. The fourth shock to the Middle East system, which is still being experienced, is what's happening in places like Syria and Yemen. Proxy wars that are killing hundreds of thousands of people with no end in sight. The numbers in Syria are staggering. Probably more than 400,000 killed, millions displaced either internally or forced out of the country as refugees, putting tremendous strain and pressure on surrounding countries, Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, as well as creating crises in Europe of what to do about a humanitarian problem that can't be ignored but also can't be handled well. And it's not just a civil war. It's not just a war in which the Assad regime has decided that it's worth killing a lot of people in order to remain in power. It's a war in which the United States and Russia are engaged in competition, in which Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Iran, Hezbollah, the Gulf states, are also engaged in this proxy set of activities that make it so challenging to deal with. I just returned this past weekend from a week in Moscow with my graduate students. We're doing a study of U.S.-Russian relations in the Middle East, and Princeton has the resources to be able to send us to the place that we're studying. So we went to Moscow to meet with Russian analysts and officials, just as we've been meeting with U.S. analysts and officials. And I can tell you the simple conclusion of a week of discussions, including with very senior government officials, there's no appetite for the kind of compromises that will be required to end this conflict. It may start to peter out. Conflicts sometimes do that. They don't end, they kind of just drag on until people lose the energy to continue fighting and killing each other. But the problems are going to remain. The Assad regime has no use for any dissent. It has no use for what we call civil society, for political dissent, for the involvement of groups within society in any form of governance. The opposition within Syria, which has been fractured. We brought to Princeton about 5 years ago 6 opposition groups in an effort to see whether or not they could be schooled to begin to work together. This is something that's been done in the conflict resolution process, and sometimes has proved successful. In Tajikistan, for example, outside players brought the Tajik opposition together, helped them figure out how to formulate a program, and then they were able to negotiate with the Tajik government to end that civil war. But we brought 6 groups to Princeton, and a week later there were 12 opposition groups. They had fractured even while we were talking to them. Each one wanting to be a leader and not willing to subordinate their own requirements to the larger good. What these proxy wars and internal wars have created, as we well know, are a series of problems that have worsened the situation in the Middle East. Large areas of ungoverned space, which for the past few years has been taken over by ISIS, which declared a caliphate in Syria and parts of Iraq. The fact that we have quote-unquote defeated ISIS on the ground doesn't resolve the problem of ungoverned space. Because right now, Allied troops are facing off against Syrian government forces across the Euphrates River to see who can control that space. And it has all the makings of the next chapter in this conflict. We've seen a breakdown of borders. Do borders in the Middle East mean anything anymore? You know, from Sykes-Picot, this was the agreement by the French and the British back in 1915 that hoped to decide the borders of the Middle East after World War I. Those borders pretty much stood the test of time. But are they relevant today? Are they relevant after a Kurdish referendum in which the Kurds not only have for many years demanded independence, but now have a legitimate vehicle, this referendum, to say that they have exercised their right of self-determination. And yet they're not going to get an independent state. Well, what does it mean then to have both ungoverned space and a breakdown of borders? And to add to this mix, this crisis of identity. Is there a people called Iraqi? Or are we talking about what Vice President at the time, Joe Biden, said were 3 distinct populations within that country, which probably needed to find some degree of autonomy within a federation, a confederation, a pluralistic system that would allow each to live its own life without pretending to be something that they really didn't believe that they were, i.e. Iraqi citizens. And then there's the 5th shock to the system. I'll talk about this a little bit more towards the end of my formal remarks, and that is the persistence of the Arab-Israeli conflict. We don't spend a lot of time on it today because it's not right. There's a theory in political science, you only deal with conflicts when they're ripe. And that means that both sides have to want to resolve an issue, have what's called a mutually hurting stalemate, where they've reached a point where they're both affected by the conflict, and they figure they need a way out. We're not quite at that point in the Arab-Israeli conflict. But its persistence remains a sore in a region in which the Palestinian issue means something to Arabs and Muslims. I neither want to exaggerate it nor to diminish it as an important issue. In fact, Arab regimes for many years helped create this idea of the importance of the Palestinian issue and inflated its importance among their own population. But having done that, we're now living with the consequences. where populations that have believed that this is a critical issue for their own well-being wonder why more work is not being done to resolve that issue. Now, the fact is that there is some good news over these past decades in the effort to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict. Since 1979, there's been an Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, and despite long periods of what we call the cold peace, a peace in which the Egyptians and Israelis really didn't interact people to people, there has never been a significant security violation of that treaty. And in fact, any of the possible violations that were called by the international monitors or by one side or the other were quickly resolved. Because both sides understood that the security provisions of the treaty were its core and fundamental component. And so that treaty now, for almost at 40 years, has remained a cornerstone of peace efforts. And as Middle Easterners know well, there is no war in the Middle East without Egypt. So Egypt has taken itself out of the game of war with Israel in a treaty that remains intact. And since 1994, there's been a treaty between Israel and Jordan, which also has seen its security provisions implemented faithfully on both sides. There is good news in the peace process. There's also a lot of bad news. There's bad news in continued Palestinian violence and terrorism. There's bad news in incitement in public Palestinian media and their school system. There's bad news in continued Israeli settlement policy in exactly those areas that are designed to become part of a Palestinian state in a two-state solution. And so even while we've made some progress toward peace between Israelis and Palestinians and Israelis and Arabs, the two sides that are most central to this conflict, Israelis and Palestinians, have not found a way to overcome their differences and at least begin a serious process of trying to resolve those differences, which I'll come back to in a moment. The result of these systemic shocks against the backdrop of an already weak and dysfunctional Middle East have been very severely pronounced. First, we've seen state collapse. What used to be the importance of the state structures of the Middle East no longer exist. There are no sound, strong states in that region other than Israel. Maybe other than Iran, although we could debate that. And in fact, the weak states in those regions are tottering on the edge of becoming failed states, unable to govern, with all of the attendant consequences that a failed state would bring to the region. Secondly, in conjunction with the failure of states is the failure of the state system. For those who've studied the Middle East or have read extensively about the Middle East, the system in the Middle East always revolved around the triangle of Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo. And it was a kind of shifting balance of power alliance structure. Baghdad and Damascus would be aligned against Cairo. Cairo and Damascus would be aligned against Baghdad. These were the three capitals that shaped the system of the Middle East. Today, who cares about what the Egyptians, Syrians, and Iraqis say about anything, let alone about affairs in the Middle East? That state system, which, for better or worse, largely determined what happened in the region, no longer exists. And in its place, you have an increased influence of two other factors. One is what might be called the periphery, non-Arab states, Israel, Iran, and Turkey, whose importance to what happens in this region is far greater than anything that these Arab states do. And the second implication is that you have non-state actors who have risen to the fore and now largely determine the direction of what happens in the Middle East. Consider the following. Since 1973, there have been a lot of wars in the Middle East involving Israel. Not one of them has primarily involved Israel in an Arab state. You've had Israel, PLO, Israel Hamas, Israel Hezbollah. Some of the wars have drawn in Middle Eastern states. 1982 in Lebanon, that war drew in Syrian involvement. But it was primarily a war by Israel and by the PLO to deal with problems between Israel and a non-state actor. In other words, it's not just that the states themselves are weak and the state system has collapsed, but the states no longer determine whether war is going to take place or not. What are we talking about today? Will there be another war between Israel and Hezbollah? I just wrote a piece for the Council on Foreign Relations on that question. I had written a piece earlier, about 6 or 7 years ago, in which I suggested that neither side wanted to repeat what happened in 2006, which was a war that Hezbollah admitted they started without thinking through the consequences. Remember, in 2006, Hezbollah kidnapped some Israeli soldiers in an effort to hold them as hostage for the return of some prisoners in Israeli jails. Israel sent in a unit to try to recapture the soldiers. That unit was ambushed, and then the whole thing exploded into war. And it was a war that left both societies really, even though in fact it was a war in which Israel could assert it came out on top, having achieved deterrence with Hezbollah for the subsequent now almost 12 years. We're in a very touchy situation today, where Hezbollah, having now been involved in the Syrian conflict, having sustained losses, but on the other hand, having gained battlefield experience, probably feels its oats, and will be returning to a Lebanon which is far weaker than it's ever been. We saw this week Saudi Arabia forcing the resignation of the Prime Minister of Lebanon, throwing the Lebanese political system into crisis. But again, we're talking about a war between Israel and a non-state actor. The implications will draw in Arab states. Lebanon will be hurt badly should there be a war. But Lebanon doesn't determine whether there's war or peace. It's the non-state actor in this case. There's also been, as a result of these shocks, an intensification of the already severe problems that I outlined at the top of these remarks. About 15 years ago, the United Nations Development Program brought together about 70 Arab intellectuals and policymakers to try to figure out what was wrong with the Arab world. And what UNDP, the UN Development Program, said was, we don't want Westerners to do that analysis. Let the people of the region figure it out for themselves. Well, lo and behold, in the first of what became 5 Arab Human Development Reports, these 70 Arab intellectuals and public policy figures defined 3 endemic problems which the Middle East had to overcome if it was going to solve its problems. Number 1, a deficit of education. Not the absence of educational institutions, but the fact that educational institutions were not educating their students. A lot of rote memorization, overcrowded classrooms. I mentioned Cairo University as symbolic of what's happening elsewhere in the region. In other words, the educational system in the region has collapsed. Second was a deficit in what was called freedom. These folks recognized themselves that in the absence of free speech, free association, political parties, contested elections, the region wasn't going anywhere. And the third deficit, interestingly, was a deficit of women's empowerment, where it was defined that if you hold 50% of your population back from contributing significantly to the advancement of society, you're working with one arm in a situation where both arms are required. That was 15 years ago, and 5 reports ago. The last report, a couple of years ago, indicated 0 progress on any of these issues. And all of them exacerbated by all of the things that we've talked about this evening. So we get to the title of tonight's talk, finally, which is Forks in the Road. Now, some of you will recognize the origin of that. Yogi Berra, the noted philosopher, once said, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. There's actually some wisdom in that. Lewis Carroll, you recall, once said that if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. And so if we don't know where we're going, if we don't have a vision, if we don't have a strategy, if we don't have a set of tools and tactics designed to help us achieve that vision, then any road will take us to any fork in the road, and we're not going to make much progress getting to where we want to go. So what do we do about some of these issues? And I'm going to, in fairly staccato form, go down a list of to-dos, which I think may stimulate some of your questions and comments as I draw these remarks to a conclusion. First of all, on the question of Iran, which is no doubt, alongside North Korea, the biggest challenges to not only the security of the United States, but also the security of the State of Israel, and I would argue the security of the U.S. alliance, both in the Far East as well as in Europe. Number one, maintain the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. In other words, the Iran nuclear accord. It is not perfect. And I would venture to say, as many of you know from your own businesses and professions, there are few agreements into which you have entered in your own life that are perfect, in which you have gained every single thing that you wanted, and the other side gained nothing of what it wanted. This was an agreement among 6 powers on one side and Iran on the other, designed to achieve one thing, and that was to set back the Iranian nuclear program long enough to give us all breathing space and figure out how to really deal with it into the long-term future. Now, tactical decisions were made in those negotiations as to whether or not to bring into the negotiations Iran's other bad behaviors. And there are many Iranian bad behaviors: terrorism, opposition to Israel, the renunciation of history, what they're doing in Syria and Yemen and elsewhere, missile development. There's a lot of bad Iranian behavior. But a calculation was made by the 6 negotiating partners that the larger the lens aperture of these issues in the negotiations, the less likely it would be to achieve what was felt to be critical, which was to stop the Iranian program in its tracks. Now, you'll hear different people argue how close the Iranians were at the time of the JCPOA to actually being able to fabricate a weaponizable nuclear device. It certainly was less than a year, certainly, and may have been as short as a couple of months. And that no longer is the case. If you take each of the criteria established in the JCPOA, the Iranian program has been set back a substantial period. And there are problems. What do you do at the end of the 10 to 15 years, at which time many of these provisions run into what we call a sunset clause, where they end? That's a problem. But we have some time to breathe now and to think about it. And the last thing I think we would want is to unilaterally walk away from the agreement, letting Iran argue that it is the injured party, and letting Iran argue that as the injured party, it has the quote-unquote right to resume this program. It makes 0 sense. As we do that, however, there is no reason not to ratchet up pressures and sanctions and pushback against bad Iranian behaviors elsewhere. There's no reason why we should not intercept Iranian arms shipments, both to Syria for Hezbollah or to Yemen. We do support Israel's activities in this regard. We can also engage in it to show the Iranians that we mean business outside of the nuclear accord. We can do this, given our capabilities, and I would argue we need to do it in order to tell Iran that the JCPOA doesn't give it a blank check to continue bad behaviors elsewhere in the region. With respect to ISIS, you read a lot in newspapers today that we quote-unquote defeated ISIS. I have bad news for us all. We really didn't. We did defeat them, specifically in Raqqa and in Mosul. We have regained, at least temporarily, the ungoverned space that they've occupied. But like Al-Qaeda before them, they've simply morphed into something else. and they've become, in a sense, more universal by taking away their particular area where they thought that they could govern. So we are in for a very long-term struggle against whatever you want to call it, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, son and daughter of ISIS, whatever the next iteration is called. Which means that the kind of alliance structure that the United States put together over the past 5 or 6 years must be maintained. If you go back to the congressional testimony, first of General John Allen, who was our first ISIS coordinator, and now Ambassador Brett McGurk, who's been taking on this role since Allen retired, you will see about 14 different activities in which we have been involved in order to mobilize the world to deal with ISIS. Only one of them is military. There's dealing with propaganda, there's dealing with recruitment, there's dealing with financial flows, there's dealing with underlying causes. It's an extraordinarily diverse array of activities, and we're just going to have to keep doing them. And in order to keep doing them, we need allies. So the last thing we should be doing is alienating our allies. I'm going to say something political, and you can call me on it. There's no reason to tweet about our allies unless we mean something by it. We have these structures in place because they prove successful for American interests. They're hard to manage. Alliance management is a very challenging problem. But it brings tremendous benefits, as we've seen in the fight against ISIS. And so if we have to sacrifice some things that we would like in order to maintain the alliances that we need to protect our national security, it's well worth that investment. And in Syria, all options are problematic. The one option that I would strongly advise we not pursue is direct American involvement in that civil war. If you think that Iraq and Afghanistan have been interminable conflicts involving interminable American deployment, Syria would make those two look like a kindergarten play. Effectively, that means supporting what the Russians do to try to bring about an end to the conflict. They have had 7 meetings in Astana in Kazakhstan, not unsuccessful meetings. They're going to try to bring about an all-Syrian Congress in Sochi. It won't be 100% effective, but it might be a start towards a political transition. And the United States, in my view, would be well advised to support this the best we can, while also maintaining some degree of support for the opposition that has carried this fight against Assad for the past 6 years. Finally, on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and what to do about it, the administration has said, for reasons that frankly I don't understand, is that it considers this a high priority. Remember, on day 1 of Mr. Trump's presidency, right after he had been elected, he gave an interview with the Wall Street Journal, and he said this was the deal that can't be made by others, but he's going to make it. It's the ultimate deal. And the administration has invested substantial time and effort to try to bring about at least movement towards a solution. We should support it. We should hope the administration does the right thing. The question, however, is going to be what is the right thing? There are at least three concepts for how to deal with the Palestinian-Israeli crisis. And with this, I'll conclude. There's one concept which we've tried now for the past 25 or 30 years, which might be called top-down. And that is, you try to deal with the core issues between the two sides. The issue of territory and borders, the issue of Jerusalem, the issue of refugees, of security, of control over airspace and water resources, economic relations. The two sides have dealt with these issues in a succession of negotiations since Oslo in 1993. And even though they haven't succeeded, they've covered a lot of ground. In fact, if you take the positions of the parties from where they started in 93 to where they effectively ended under John Kerry in 2014, you will see a substantial narrowing of difference between the two sides on every single issue. Every single issue. So the top-down approach of suggesting that the two sides go back at it may be useful. There's also what's called a bottom-up approach, which says, look, we're not going to really solve the problems of Jerusalem and refugees and settlements and so forth. Let's improve the situation on the ground. Let's build Palestinian institutions so that if there ever is a Palestinian state, it doesn't become a failed state. Let's build a Palestinian economy so that they can provide jobs and well-being for their people. Let's build people-to-people relations between Israelis and Palestinians on the ground. Now, we've tried the bottom-up approach many times over the past 25 years. What we have found every time we've tried it is that if it's not also accompanied by top-down, the bottom-up has an expiration date. Because at some point, there are only so many things you can do on the ground before the pressure on the ground starts to build and people walk away from the progress that you think is being made. There's also a third approach called outside in. And this may be what the administration is trying to do, and that is bring the Arab world more directly into the peace process. Now, this is not necessarily a poor choice. Back in 2002, the Arab world, in the summit meeting held in Beirut, and then reaffirmed in a summit meeting in Riyadh in 2007 and subsequently, the Arab world agreed on what has become known as the Arab Peace Initiative, which I would argue is a cosmic change in Arab state policy. Because until 2002, Arab state policy effectively looked at the Arab-Israeli conflict as starting in 1948, and therefore to resolve that conflict, you had to go back to 1948 or 1947, the partition plan, and redo history. That was until 2002. In the Arab Peace Initiative, the Arab world said, no, we've given up on that. And what needs to be fixed is the results of 1967. In other words, the occupation of Judea, Samaria, the West Bank, Gaza, Golan Heights. And the Arabs said in the Arab Peace Initiative, if you can resolve those issues, the Arab world will provide Israel with the recognition, the normalization, and the security that it has so long sought. So the Arab world has changed. It's changed dramatically. And we see some of that change today in the better relations, even if they're sub rosa, between Israel and many of its neighbors. We know that the Israelis and Saudis are talking, and they're sharing intelligence, and they're doing security together. We know that the Israelis and a variety of Arab states are working together. This is a manifestation of change in the Arab world. And so the outside-in approach could actually be useful in representing a kind of support structure for the peace process. What this argues for, my last point, is an integrated strategy in which you have outside-in, top-down, bottom-up. It sounds like a cholent. We can throw everything in, and at the end, it tastes pretty good. The answer is it would taste pretty good. Because if you could manage a complex strategy in which you've brought the Arab states into this process, bearing some responsibility for its outcome, while you are improving the situation on the ground, and while you are grappling with solvable problems related to the core issues, there is a chance that we could actually make progress toward peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Dr. Kurtzer, for that fascinating, compelling, and sweeping presentation of Israel and the Middle East. Ambassador Kurtzer has graciously agreed to take some questions, a few questions, and some of the Ezra Kozins do the difficult job of calling us on people. And a couple of key points is to keep the question brief and with a question mark at the end. Thank you so much.
I'm going to start with one of my own, if that's okay, because going on what you started with. Do you see that the United States is the same power it was in the previous generation over the last couple of years? And where is the United States' power going in relation to this discussion? Forward.
The hard, as I mentioned in the remarks, the hard elements of our power are not only the same, but they're in some ways even more intense. We are still the technological leader in military and economic affairs. We're still the number one economic power. There's no diminution of American hard power. What we've seen over the past decade and a half is a question of whether or not the United States wants to continue to play the supreme role that it had previously played in the Middle East. Now, some of that is a reaction to the kind of policy that was pursued by George W. Bush, a reaction to using our military as a intervening force to resolve all problems on the one hand, and as a tool to try to bring about democratic change on the other hand. The reaction to that in the Obama administration was to say, no, that's not in our interest, and we have to decide very carefully, as Obama said in several of his speeches, where issues in the Middle East directly impact either the United States or our allies. And if issues in the Middle East don't directly impact the United States or our allies, then those are issues in which we would take a reduced role. Now that's been described by many as a retreat of American power or weakening of American power. I would argue that it's, rather than describe it as a retreat or a weakening, it's a reassessment of where to invest in our power. Obama talked about a pivot to Asia, and of course here we are on the west coast of the United States, which I normally don't think about because I'm on the other side of the country, but we're a Pacific power, and we have to invest in our relationships in Asia. I would argue in this regard, and here too there may be differences of view, that a fundamental mistake of this administration was pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Not because it was flawless, but because it had within it the elements that could have built over time the equivalent of the transatlantic relationship, including with the EU and with NATO. And if one wanted evidence of that, go back to the period when we were negotiating TPP, and you'll see how hard China tried to stop it. Because they understood that it was not just a trade agreement, it was a political coming together of an alliance structure which over time was going to present them with strategic problems. So the pivot to Asia as part of the diminishing of what we're doing in the Middle East may be a calculated strategy of reorienting our national priorities. And you ask the question, what is our real interest in Syria? And the fact of the matter is, other than humanitarian, which is real, we're a country that cares, we don't have any interest in Syria. We never did. What is our real interest in Iraq, other than part of the assurance of the export of energy resources? Iraq has an interest in exporting its energy resources. Why do we feel that we're the ones that should be primarily responsible? So I think it's fair to reject the idea that we're somehow a weaker country, even if we're diminishing some of our stated interests in this particular region.
Knowing that that is a problem, what makes us believe that we can create a vending between Israel and the Palestinian nation?
Well, they're really apples and oranges in some respect. A few years ago, Natan Sharansky wrote a book, he called it The Case for Democracy, in which he argued that Israel would not enjoy peace, real peace with the Arab world, unless the Arab world democratized. And that's an argument, but it's not an argument that I subscribe to, because it would require such fundamental change that's unlikely that you're talking about Israel not enjoying peace. Israel made peace with an Egypt that's certainly not democratic, made peace with a Jordan that's not democratic, and those treaties have withstood the test of time, even in the Egyptian case where you had an upheaval in which Mubarak was thrown out of office and you went through a period of Muslim Brotherhood governance. So there's a reality in the Middle East that you have to deal with, and that is that you're not going to be making peace, in the first instance, if you're Israel, you're not going to be making peace with democratic neighbors. And therefore, the kinds of things that you require in the treaty may be more intense. I was talking with the rabbi earlier today. I'm a security hawk. I may be in favor of a very strong peace process, but the more challenging that process is, the more it has to bend towards Israel with respect to security requirements. And that's the guarantor, if there is a guarantee, in a situation where you've signed a treaty with a non-democratic neighbor. Now, in the short term, there are some advantages to signing a treaty with a non-democratic neighbor. You know who the dictator is. You know where the source of power is. But the long term is questionable, and that's why you need to maintain a very significant degree of vigilance. Security requirements will go up after a peace treaty with the Palestinians rather than down. U.S. aid should go up rather than down. Access to American technology should go up rather than down, because we are uncertain as to whether or not a treaty with a non-democratic neighbor is sustainable over time. It's the trust but verified phenomenon, and that's, I think, the way this needs to be looked at.
Do you agree with President Trump that Kerry type of mediation effort is obsolete? And if you don't agree with that, what could we have done differently in the Kerry episode to make it succeed?
Can you repeat the question?
The question is whether I agree with President Trump that a Kerry-like peace process is obsolete, and if I don't agree with President Trump that it's obsolete, what should be done to make it work more effectively? Is that a fair approximation of the question? Look, John Kerry actually conducted a process which at the time was the most sophisticated kind of diplomacy that we had played in the Middle East peace process since the time of James Baker's arranging the Madrid Peace Conference, which was the earlier sophisticated diplomacy. And the reason I call it that is that Kerry didn't simply bring the two sides to the negotiating table and say, well, let's negotiate. Before he even started, he took a number of steps to condition the atmosphere. He called together the Arab foreign ministers so that they would reiterate the Arab Peace Initiative. He commissioned General John Allen, who, in addition to running the ISIS effort, had also undertaken a very serious security study in conjunction with the Israeli Defense Forces on what Israel's requirements would be in the context of a peace settlement. And he asked Allen to accelerate that work so that when we get to the security issues in a peace treaty, we would know whether or not what we could do would compensate Israel for the tangible things that it would give up, territory, strategic depth, and so forth. He supported efforts both by the Davos Forum to promise a $4 billion investment in a future Palestinian state, provided that its economy was open. And he supported a private sector Israeli-Palestinian initiative in which business communities on the two sides came together to start doing joint projects. This was before he even started any diplomacy. He then went to Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Abbas, and he said, we're going to aim to get to negotiations, but we have to do two things before we do that. Number one, we have to stop the deterioration of your relations on the ground. And for Israel, that meant a slowdown in settlement activity. Prime Minister never committed to stop settlement activity, but he did commit to slow down settlement activity. And on the basis of Palestinian demand, the Prime Minister agreed to release some political prisoners who were very important. I should say political prisoners. Some prisoners who were important to the Palestinians who had been jailed since the Oslo agreement was signed. In other words, long-term prisoners. And on the Palestinian side, the Palestinians agreed as a confidence-building measure that they would not pursue their independent state in international fora. That was the way to condition the atmosphere. Second thing that Kerry did was to say, if we're going to get to negotiations, we need terms of reference. Now, again, for any of you who've ever negotiated anything, you don't walk into a room without a sense of an agenda or a sense of how you narrow the starting point differences between the two sides. So Kerry did not want to simply bring the two sides in, and one would say X and the other would say, or one would say A and the other would say Z. He wanted to find a way to create these terms of reference so that when they walked into the room, they would actually have narrowed the starting point of negotiations. And that's what he tried to do. It was a very sophisticated diplomatic process that he undertook. The problem is it didn't succeed. It didn't succeed for several reasons. Number one, there was a difference of view at the end in the spring of 2014 over the question of the prisoners to be released. Palestinians believed that Israel had agreed to release some Israeli Arab citizens who had been jailed for security offenses. Prime Minister Netanyahu said he would never agree to release Israeli Arab citizens in response to a Palestinian demand. If he wants to release his own citizens, he will do that, but he won't do it as part of a bargain with the Palestinians. Palestinians also then went to 14 different UN agencies to gain recognition of their state, and the thing fizzled out almost immediately. In other words, as far as they got, and from what we understand, and again, I don't have the inside skinny on this, I was not part of the government, the differences on the terms of reference question, the substantive issue, had been narrowed. They hadn't yet been bridged, but they had been narrowed, but the process fizzled. And since it was right before a US midterm election, Obama, in my view, made a tremendous mistake. He called a pause in the process, and it never recovered. So, you know, saying, do I agree with President Trump or not agree with President Trump, it misses the point. If President Trump rejects everything that Secretary Kerry did, it would be a terrible mistake, because you need that top-down process, even if you want to bring Arab parties in or build relations on the ground. So if you reject the top-down process entirely, which I hope he doesn't, it would be a mistake of immense proportions. If you adopt it together with these other elements, and you learn from what went wrong in that process, you may be able to make some progress.
President Trump doesn't agree with himself. His initial statement was that we're going to move the embassy to Jerusalem. You're an ambassador to Israel as well as Egypt. That would be your home. What are your personal feelings about moving the embassy to Jerusalem?
You know, every president in memory has made the commitment to move the embassy to Jerusalem until he has become president, and then has decided it probably isn't a wise idea. So President Trump is following a long tradition of American presidents who sentimentally and politically make the argument to do that, and then understand that diplomatically it's not such a good idea. I can give you a long version of my view, and I guess this is the last question. Okay, so you're going to have to sit through a slightly longer version. The significant mistake on the part of American policy was made in 1948, when after Israel took control of West Jerusalem and established its capital in West Jerusalem, we should have put our embassy in West Jerusalem. We could have done it with a caveat. We could have said, we're putting it here, but this is without reference to the final determination of the boundary, without reference to final status of the city, without reference to X, Y, and Z. But there was no reason not to put our, in my view, to put our embassy in the location that Israel declared as its capital. So from 1948 to 67, this was, in my view, a mistake in American policy, and since I'm old but not that old, I can blame it on others. I was not part of the administration at that time to make that argument. The problem for the United States became compounded in 1967 when Israel took control over the whole city and expanded the municipal boundaries. Because then, putting the embassy in that Jerusalem could not have been done without some reference to the fact that Israel had now expanded the boundaries of the city unilaterally and had declared the expanded boundaries of the city to be its capital. It made it a much more challenging problem diplomatically for the United States, and frankly, in my view, it became a justification for the United States not to move the embassy at that point. Again, mistake, the first 19 years, the problem became exacerbated with the change in the status of Jerusalem after 67, and we're still living with that change in status. Now, are there conditions under which, or circumstances under which we could move the embassy? The answer is yes. In 1993, you may recall that Shimon Peres announced to Secretary of State Warren Christopher the fact that Oslo had been agreed in mid-August of '93, and then we held the signing ceremony in Washington on September 13th. About a month in between. During that month, I normally don't talk about myself, but I will tell you at that time I proposed that we do two things. We move our embassy to West Jerusalem, and we create a diplomatic facility in East Jerusalem to represent United States interests of the Palestinians. It wouldn't be an embassy because there's no state at the time, but it would be a significant diplomatic presence. The argument I made was that the earthquake of the Oslo Agreement, which shook everything up, Israel and the PLO exchanging mutual recognition, talking for the first time, coming up with a framework for future negotiations, provided an opportunity to resolve an old problem that should have been resolved many years earlier. In policy world, sometimes your views get accepted and sometimes they don't. And in this case, those views were not accepted. We didn't do it. And frankly, I'm waiting for another moment in which the shakeup of politics and diplomacy in the region would allow for this kind of creative move. We don't have that now. Now, the last point I make on this is, so what happens if we do move the embassy? There's all kinds of word out there. You know, there will be an upheaval, an explosion, and so forth. We don't know. Maybe there would be, and maybe there wouldn't be. It may be that the Palestinians would be very upset. We saw how upset they were when a magnetometer was put outside the Temple Mounds for security purposes. We saw how much that upset them, largely for political reasons, but still, you had the implications of it. We also saw years ago when I think he was an Australian citizen tried to set fire to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. You remember what happened? The American consulate in Karachi was burned down. So whether or not the Palestinians are upset, which they probably would be, but even if they aren't upset, you're going to have a lot of people upset in the rest of the Muslim world. The question is it worth it? What's the gain diplomatically from doing something that's politically quite important and emotionally quite important? And in this case, you weigh the two sides of the argument. The political, emotional gain is substantial, no question about it. Mr. Trump could say that he fulfilled the promise of his campaign. Might be the first one that he's fulfilled, but I'm sorry, that's my political view. I couldn't resist. So it would be politically very important to him. Emotionally, it would mean a lot. You know, we've had a lot of back and forth with Israel on this question, including a case that went to the Supreme Court about a child whose passport now says was born in Jerusalem but doesn't have a state next to it. On the other hand, is it worth the question of what it would do to the diplomatic process? And that's the choice that Mr. Trump is facing. And so far, he's basically said he's not willing to make the political, emotional choice over the